To unline, press star 6
Hello everyone,
or
and welcome
pound
to the
6.
GED Testing Service webinar on Webb's Depth of Knowledge, transitioning to the 2014 GED test. This webinar is one of a series of professional development webinars that we are hosting to help you and the others in the adult education community understand the new GED test that's going to be launching in 2014 and to get prepared for that. So we're happy to have you all viewing this webinar recording with us today. Martin K. I'm the Vice President of Products, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. And with us we have Bonnie Goonan and Susan Pittman as our presenters. These are two very experienced adult education professional developers who have lots of experience with the GED testing program over many, many years. And they're going to help introduce us to the topic on Webb's depth of knowledge today. Three topics really for the webinar today are including some general information on Webb's depth of knowledge, what that framework is like and why it's important. And then we'll look at some sample questions with some depth of knowledge levels from the item samplers that were released earlier this year. And we'll also talk about some beginning strategies for implementing depth of knowledge in the adult education classroom. I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about today's learning objectives.
Thank you. Today we are going to talk just a little bit about that concept of Webb's depth of knowledge, which for many of us may be a new phrase, a new process. We're looking at alignment of standards and assessment. We're also going to talk about what is the difference between difficulty and complexity. And then, as Marty said, we're going to talk about some basic tasks that are related to each of the DOK levels and get started a little bit with ideas on how we can build some instructional approaches. So what is Webb's depth of knowledge? Just a bit of history. In 1997, that is, Norman Webb from the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he developed this process and criteria for analyzing how standards and standardized assessments could be aligned. And he called his model depth of knowledge, oftentimes referred to as DOK. And so as we look forward into the 2014 GED test, what you'll see is very similar to what is currently being used in the P through 12 system. That is the depth of knowledge model. It is a demand that clicks into higher order thinking skills, and it does link standards in an instructional design and assessment. DOK focuses on the content standards. It focuses on, again, what a student needs to do is complete an assessment. Many of us are very familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It's important to realize that with Webb, it is not a taxonomy. It is not ability levels. So let's take a little closer look at DOK, or depth of knowledge. There's 4 levels to Webb's depth knowledge, and we'll talk about each of this and give you some ideas of what it really means. But level 1 is recall. Level 2 is known as skills and concepts. 3 is strategic thinking, and level 4 is extended thinking. And remember, it's not a taxonomy, so it doesn't go from least difficult to more difficult, but rather talks about complexity. DOK, again, going to say over and over, is not about difficulty. Difficulty refers to how many students in our classroom may answer a question correctly. In fact, if I asked many of my GED students what's the definition of the word exaggerate, they'd be able to very easily tell me that's a DOK level 1 recall. Again, I have to do is click into my mind, okay, what is the definition of exaggerate? However, if I ask those same students the definition of pellucid, they met me, in fact, I'd guarantee you, look at me with this blank look on their face. It's a much more difficult question And yet it is still a DOK-1 recall. You either know the definition or don't. Recalling a definition is an example of a DOK-1 level. DOK, again, is not about difficulty. It's about complexity. The level of complexity is identified in each of the assessment targets for the 2014 GED test. However, if our students are going to be able to be successful on this test, they have to be first instructed in those different levels. And so as we go forward, we need to make sure that we are including each of the DOK levels into not only our classroom assessments, but instruction as well. So let's take a little closer look at each of the levels and what a sample question may look like. So Susan, just through DOK-1 for us.
That sounds good. DOK Level 1, as Bonnie mentioned just a few minutes ago, is about recall. It requires that an individual recalls some specific information. It might be a fact, it could be a definition, or we do this quite often when we're looking at math, a simple process maybe that we're using in order to divide numbers. But those are the types of things that we would see when we talk about DOK Level 1. As earlier stated, the test taker is either going to know that information or not. It can involve not just one step, but a set of procedures, performing simple calculations, or recalling information. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. May need to recall facts, such as what we found within a text or an excerpt that we've just read. We want to be able to identify the characteristics of a particular character in that excerpt that we've read. Or we might have to do a formula. Maybe we need to calculate the perimeter or area of a rectangle. We're determining whether or not we have to, how much carpet we're going to need to buy in order to do a specific task. Those things all are recall items. We might describe the characteristics, the physical features of a place, or we might be doing some type of science project, and we need to know some processes that are involved. Different keywords that often denote this particular level, such as list or identify, define, and describe. So take a look at a sample question from the item sampler, and this is from Reasoning Through Arts. And as we take a look at this, you'll notice that 20% of the questions on the 2014 GED test will be at a level 1. In this particular case, we have the student would read the excerpt from Anne of Green Gables. And notice at the top there, it's a little bit longer excerpt as we move through. And they have to drag and drop the events into the chart to show the order in which they occur in the excerpt. So there are actually 4 different events. The student has to recall what they've read and then list them in the correct order as they're moving through. So an incredibly complex item, because in this particular case, that particular excerpt is in chronological order, and the student merely needs to be able to insert that information. So again, we have a level 1 DOK. So Bonnie, you want to take a look at level 2?
Level 2 is often referred to as the basic application of skills and concepts. And again, it's a little more complex type of task because it requires that students go beyond that recalling or reproducing of a response. In fact, they need to make some decisions as how to approach a question or a problem. And usually, this type of question or this level would imply more than one step. Level 2 oftentimes would be such things as students would be asked to compare or contrast people, place, events, maybe classify or sort items into different types of categories, or maybe even determine some points of view. Let's take a look at what those may look like in the classroom. You are teaching, instructing students at a level 2 to be asked to identify and maybe summarize the major events or conflicts in something that they're reading. They need to compare and contrast, such as if I were teaching social studies, compare, contrast communism and democracy, or certain tropical environment. Sometimes a level 2 may be including such things as a cause-effect of a historical event, or maybe even predicting logical outcome. What do you think would happen? In math, often we have students classify geometric figures to what fits into what category. And of course, graphic literacy. Can students not only retrieve information, but also then use it? Important as we look at DOK Level 2 to realize that on the 2014 GED test, as Susan said, 20% of the questions will be at the recall level, which is Level 1, but 80% of the questions will be at DOK Level 2 or Level 3. So we'll look at a Level 2 question. We're going to use the same excerpt that Susan did in her example of a Level 1 question. So test takers have already read the excerpt, but let's take a look at what they're asked to do now. It says, drag and drop each word that describes Anne into the character web. So the test taker needs to, of course, comprehend the text, synthesize the information about Anne's characterization, and describe why they feel that way. The important thing to remember is the word dramatic or the word practical, etc., doesn't exist in the excerpt, but rather students or test takers need to infer from text which of those words describe Anne and why. So it's how or why that often distinguishes a Level 2 item. So let's take a look at Level 3.
We continue working through Webb's depth of knowledge. We look at Level 3, which is strategic thinking. And when we reach this level, we're really looking at a deeper understanding. Or the test takers are going to have to go through and they're going to have to plan and use evidence. And this is much more demanding as far as their cognitive reasoning skills go. We often think at this level about the fact that at Level 3, these demands are very complex and they're often abstract. And in an assessment item that's at Level 3, there's usually more than one possible answer. So a student is going to have to justify their response and use multiple steps as they move through. So let's look at some examples here. When we take a look at Level 3 examples, be analyzing or evaluating the effectiveness of literary elements, which might be characterization or setting, the point of view, and different structures. Or in math, a student may be required to solve a multiple-step problem and provide support for why that problem and that answer is justified as they move through. We're comparing and then analyzing certain actions and what was the impact of those answers. If we wanted to look at that from a science context, we could look at it from a standpoint of how do certain things that consumers do impact their environment as they're moving in. We could develop a scientific model for a complex idea or propose and then evaluate solutions for economic problems. But again, we're coming back and we're explaining and connecting ideas and we're using that supporting evidence as we move through. And then we're talking about, 80% of items on the test being between Level 2 and 3. And as we look at some of the items, specifically, let's look at a sample Level 3 GED question. You hear that we have a short answer response that is included in this particular one. So after looking at a short answer response, what would we be expecting that students would be required to do? And that they would need to read, they would need to analyze the text, evaluate the text that's there, develop their reason, and then support everything with evidence. And as you look through each of the different items with the extended response as well as looking at the short answers provided throughout the 2014 GED test item sampler, you'll see over and over again, read the information, analyze what you've read, make a determination, and then support that determination based on the evidence that is provided. Again, much more complex than we have seen in the past as we're asking students to work with different items. So now we move on and take a look at the next one. Bonnie, you want to take us through extended thinking?
Definitely. And you probably noticed if you were doing the math, 20% and 80% says to us that DOK Level 4 will not be assessed at that level on the 2014 GED test. However, it's really important for us to know that this level of complexity really needs to be integrated into our adult ed classrooms because it is a part of our workplace. It's a kind of skill level that students need as they go on to post-secondary ed. DOK 4 extended thinking does require a very high cognitive demand because students need to make what we would term non-routine types of connections across different disciplines, different contents. But they're not just about time with DOK 4, it really is about the level of complexity. Let's look at a few examples so we get a better idea of what a DOK 4 would look like. As we use DOK 4 thinking skills all the time in our daily lives. In fact, if I were to choose a new career, I'd go out and gather all the information that I need. I'd analyze what would be the pros and cons of each choice. I'd interpret, oh gosh, should I go here to school? Should I go there to school? Is it going to take longer than, I would get a good return on my investment? And I even draft for myself some type of a worksheet to show me what I did. That would be a level 4. I'm in K through 12 programs in high school. Students do literary analysis, where they do take a very, very strong look at some author's work. They look at the different techniques that are used, points of view, etc., and they do craft a paper analysis. We problem solve. When we problem solve in the workplace, we use level 4 because we've got to identify the problem and all the different types of solution paths out there. And most of the time we try solving it. If it works, great. We report that we did well. If it doesn't work, we go back again, see whether we did get the problem specified correctly the first time, are there alternate paths, and then go again. Students are extremely creative. And they write or produce an original work, poetry, a song. Those levels of very complex thinking skills. And again, those are the kinds of things we do in such things as project-based learning in the adult ed classroom. Important thing to remember is that Webb's depth of knowledge is more than just getting ready for a test. The complexity of thinking skills that are needed for life. So though it is a common theme among the 4 content area tests, that demonstration of higher order thinking skills is more than just about a test. It's the way we really think and learn. Now, we talked about 4 very specific areas where 80% of the test will be 2 3s, 20% will be 1, but it's important to look at it as a whole. So let's talk about the cumulative aspect.
If we take and think about this in terms of your own life, rarely are things just done in isolation. We usually have a number of embedded skills that we use. So we take a look at that very first standard. Analyze text in order to identify, understand, infer, or synthesize information. That would really be at a level 3. In order to perform that level, there are other things you're going to need to be able to do. That's what we call, and Bonnie and I have finally called these things the embedded skills that are required in order to be able to do this. DOK 1, if we're going to analyze a text, we're going to have to read it. DOK 2, we're going to have to understand. And then finally, we're going to be to apply that information, which is what it's asking us to do. Even that one, apply knowledge of sentence structure and composing or editing. We have to know the parts first, that call, in order to be able to write sentences or those sentences as we're moving through. And can continue on through looking at predicting trends, and that was based on graphical representation. Each of those items, that type of work, requires really 3 different things that you're doing. You're determining how many, you're comparing, you're making decisions. Rarely is it that we just have to do one thing, that basic recall, but usually we're pulling all of that information together as we're working through this. So let's take a look at our next slide and talk a little bit about time. One of the things that time alone is not a distinguishing factor in determining the DOK level of an item, because quite honestly, many times people say, oh, well, higher the DOK level, or, when we're looking at DOK 3, it's going to take longer than it's going to take in order to do other things. But we're taking a look at this particular one. If we're collecting data samples, that's what we call it, collecting data samples, that's at level DOK 1. That's probably going to take more time than organizing that information into a chart. So it's not just about time as we're moving through, but rather the level of complexity of the different items that we're working with. And as we take a look across the different levels and using information, as we look at this next slide, you'll see that, as you saw in the examples from the item sampler, different standards can be assessed using the same text, but different levels of complexity. Just we have right now with the current series of the GED test, there are quite a few times that students will go through and they read an excerpt and they have multiple questions that go along with that and would ask them to do different things as they're moving through. So this particular chart shows how question complexity changes the type of product that's required. So if a student had to recall, they would look for key ideas or information in a passage. If looking at skills and concepts at level 2, they'd identify information in the passage that's supported by facts itself. Then moving on to strategic thinking, they would use that evidence from that passage in order to formulate their response to a particular one. So as we move through here, we're looking at much more than what we have in the past, but really looking at that complexity, which is so essential for our students as they move on to GED test, but also into post-secondary and into careers, that they have that more complex ability to think through the different processes needed. Sometimes what we do is we look at it and we think, well, we're used to dealing with a verb that explains to us in Bloom's taxonomy right now. We're used to looking at that, but I think in this case, it's more just a verb, isn't it?
We've said that it's not about time, it's not about difficulty, and it's not about the verb either. In fact, many of us have written lesson plans more than we would like to remember, where they're based upon Bloom's taxonomy. You tell me the verb, and I could tell you what level you were expecting my students to perform at. With Webb's depth of knowledge, it is not determined by the verb. In fact, let's take a look at the verb and the different DOK levels. As the verb describe. DOK 1, which of course is recall, I'm going to say describe 3 characteristics of metamorphic rocks. Not complex. All students have to do is click it from the back of their mind. Simple recall. But I can use that same verb at the DOK 2 level, and I can say describe the difference between metamorphic and igneous rocks. Again, it takes a more complex process because the student has to recall the information and then compare and contrast to identify differences. DOK 2. But I'll go to a DOK 3. using the same verb and say, describe a model that you might use to represent the relationships that exist within the rock cycle. Then students have to have that simple recall, of course. They also have to be able to do differences, similarities, but they've got to go beyond that complexity-wise. They've got to understand that whole cycle and decide how are they going to represent it. Verb through DOK levels. There again, it is not about difficulty, time, even the verb. It's about complexity. So things to remember about DOK. First of all, it is a scale of cognitive demand, and it is descriptive because it focuses on the assessment item, not student work in order to determine the level. It's all not the same as difficulty, and it's definitely not the same as Bloom's taxonomy. So, this is a real basic overview of Webb, but before we close out today, we want you to just take a few moments with us to check your Webb's knowledge. So in the next few slides, Susan's going to take you through a couple questions from the 2014 GED Test Item Sampler. And the task is going to be to determine, do you think each item is a DOK level 1, 2, or 3? So begin.
Okay, let's take a look at question 1. In this particular question, what you see is that you see information that's provided. In this particular case, you have a chart and you have other items that are included on pages 2 and 3. And the statement asks you, which statement correctly describes an important way that the process of amending the U.S. Constitution is different from the process of creating federal laws? Think for just a moment about the level of complexity that will be required in order to answer this type of question. So about 5 seconds to think through. In this particular question, the answer is DOK2. What the test taker is asked to do is to draw a contrast between the process of amending the U.S. Constitution and that of creating federal laws. Use the information from the chart, which shows the methods, along with the test taker's own knowledge of how federal laws are made. The tester can then analyze the major steps in the process and the governmental branches that are involved. This item engages reasoning skills needed to analyze both processes and identify a major difference. So we have a DOK level 2. Now look at question 2. In this particular one, we have an excerpt that's being read, and also we have a graph outlines the number of women in the U.S. House of Representatives for that time span, 1917 all the way to 2011. And in this particular case, a test taker would need to type in a response. The number of women representatives who served in the Congress was twice the number of women representatives who served in the 101st Congress. So think for just a moment. Would the cognitive complexity of this particular item be level 1, 2, or 3? In this case, we have DOK2. Again, it's not just basic recall, but in order to determine the correct answer to this item, there's actually 3 steps that are involved. The tester has to assess the value of a specified data point on a graph, use that value to do basically a simple mathematical calculation, and then use the resulting value to find the answer on the graph. The test taker is not specifically directed as to the steps, but needs to figure out for himself or herself how to determine that answer. So although the calculation itself is very simple, the reasoning, the logic, and the graph reading skills push to a DOK level 2. So let's look at question 3. In this particular question, we have an excerpt that the student will need to read, an excerpt talking about tropical rainforest and a specific parasitic fungi and insect host. The question is asking them to explain how deforestation could up the life cycle, and they have to go through and they have to put multiple pieces of evidence from the text to support their answer. Do something for just a moment. What's particular DOK level B? If DOK 3, then you're absolutely correct. Test takers are required to cite specific textual evidence and develop a logical argument. That is a much more complex task than what we have seen previously. Taker is going to need to select and present evidence from the information that they've read, use a line of reasoning in order to compose a response. And then they're going to have to bring in a little of their own understanding of ecosystems and cycles to explain how deforestation can be disrupted. So as we're taking a look at this, the test taker is using, producing, and justifying an argument. All of this to present the information, their ideas, into this presentation. So we'll look at a DOK level 3. So Bonnie, you want to go through and take a look at the next few questions for us?
Okay, it's time out for math. And we saw this one in a previous webinar, but this one, again, is asking for the test taker to simplify this expression and to leave the answer in radical form. So having take a look at this problem at a DOK 1, 2, 3. And it is a DOK 1. It's basically an arithmetic problem. The test taker just multiplies the numbers contained in the square roots, comes them into a product that has one single square root, and then factors that product. Although it may be difficult for some of our students, complexity is not there, so it is a DOK level 1. Let's take a look at one last question to see how your DOK levels are going. And here again, we have a math question. Times in our math classes, we teach mean, median, mode. That's a real common skill to teach. Particular question provides data for 10 people for an experiment. And it says that the person who is doing this, the speech pathologist, knows the median of the data, but there is missing data somewhere. And so the test taker needs to identify the data. Is it a DOK 1, 2, or 3 question? This particular one is a DOK 2. It is a drag drop. It requires the test taker to actually work backwards in context of figuring out statistical averages. Something oftentimes we don't have students do. It does require a great deal of reasoning because, again, the test taker has to first recognize that one data point must be related to the mode of 2 and then to determine the remaining data point. And then once they've realized which data points are missing, to drop to the appropriate place. It's a very complex reasoning process, and having to use the graphics as well. So a strong indicator of DOK level 2. We'll tell you that the item samplers that you can download, that Marty will tell you about in a little bit, do have the DOK levels listed in them, which is a great assistance as we're learning this new process. So as you get started integrating these higher level thinking skills and this more demanding level of cognitive rigor into your GED program, let's start with a few basic strategies. First of all, use questions that ask students to explain their answers. It's enough just to get the correct answer or any answer, but how and why did you get the answer you did? Apply reading, writing, and math skills with challenging content in all of the areas. Just like in our workplaces, it's not always one correct answer. So use open-ended questions as much as you can in your classroom so that students can share their evidence or their reasons why they did what they did to get their answers. And of course, as we said earlier, don't forget all of the wonderful resources that are available on the GED Testing Service website. So as we close out this webinar on Webb's depth of knowledge and kind of the Webb 101, please give some information and update on what's available to us.
And thank you, Susan. So I hope that you've been able to glean from this webinar today the importance of the depth of knowledge framework. You know, in educational philosophy in years gone by, we thought about high school and public education in general as sort of an opportunity to pour all kinds of knowledge into students' heads that then they could give back to us at some point and recall. And what we've discovered over the years is that it's really not the recall of all of that information that's so important. It's being able to probably recall some things, basic foundational knowledge, but then to be able to know what information is most important and then to be able to apply that information in different kinds of real-life situations. And so that's why as we look at the concept of high school equivalency and current college readiness, the Depth of Knowledge framework really helps us to focus in on how individuals' thinking skills need to be developed and how we can assess whether they have the appropriate level of skills to be successful in the workplace and in post-secondary education. And so I want to just close by looking at some of the resources that we have on our GED Testing Service website. The website was redone earlier in 2012, and it's being updated all the time now. And here's an example of a page that's part of our assessment information page, and this is highlighted in blue is the page about the 2014 test, but there's all kinds of other resources here. Specific information about the current testing program and what's happening with the 2002 test as we close that out, information about the GED test on computer itself, what does that computer framework look like, tutorials about that and so forth, links to news, research reports, links here to the assessment guide for educators that we haven't really talked about in this webinar, but many of you are probably familiar with. That assessment guide gives all of the outlines of content and how the information is going to be assessed on the new test. The information about the assessment development, how does the test come to be, what processes do we go through, the links to the item samplers, which are key resources for you in helping you to understand what kinds of questions are going to be asked on the new test, and then therefore what kinds of questions might you be able to put into place in your instruction to help people get ready for that test. And of course, another important link here is a place to sign up for assessment alerts. So if you register on our website, you can put your name and title and email address in here, and as soon as something new is available on the website, we'll send you an update email to let you know that that's available and how to get to it. So lots and lots of resources available on our website, again, being updated all the time. And so thank you all for your attention this afternoon. I want to express my thanks particularly to Bonnie and Susan for leading the discussion and helping to increase your knowledge of the Webb's Depth of Knowledge framework. If you are listening to this webinar, then you've probably registered on our website for invitations to future webinars and other resources that are available to you. But if you haven't, make sure that you do sign up for those, and you will be invited to future webinars where you can listen to live or, as in this session, on demand. In addition, although this session was recorded especially for the web and it wasn't interactive per se, you still can pose questions to us at any time, and you can submit those via email to our special email address that's geared toward the 2014 test, and so that's GED 2014 at GEDtestingservice.com. That again, GED 2014 at GEDtestingservice.com. And so we ask you to submit questions at any time to that email address, and they'll be answered personally. And then those answers are often then collected and posted in frequently asked question repositories on our website, yet another resource available to you. And so I'd like to close out the session for today, and thank you for being with us, and bid you a good afternoon, good evening, and good luck to you in the future.